Welcome back. We are still talking about conceptions of culture, and we're linking it to multicultural education right now, and doing that by going through some of the formal and informal definitions that Thomas Wren outlined in chapter 1 of his book called Conceptions of Culture. We had just talked about several different, whoops, it's funny with the writing without the words. Several different early definitions of of multicultural education, and we were working through some more recent definitions of multicultural education, and noting that there was this transition from multicultural education being simply a cultural pluralism in education to thinking about ways that multicultural education was actually actively creating equality of educational opportunities for students from different backgrounds or cultural groups, how multicultural education was being defined as a way to identify or to validate or to investigate one's own identity and understand others through one's own ethnic or cultural identity, as well as multicultural education being a way to eliminate issues of ethnocentrism and other sorts of exclusionary ideas about education, ethnicity, and culture. And we were making some observations that in some of the more recent multicultural definitions, there is a shift towards some democratic and social values that are uniquely maybe American, and wondering if that was going to have any impact on the ways that we think about sociocultural issues in comparative and international education. And I wanted to look at these last two formal and informal definitions of multicultural education and talk about them briefly. So for this one, we have multicultural education is the process of comprehensive school reform and basic education for all students. It challenges and rejects racism and other forms of discrimination in schools and society, and accepts and affirms various forms of pluralism. So we've come back now to this idea of pluralism, and that there are multiple ways to think about culture, and that understanding that there are many cultures that are coexisting is an important part of multicultural education. And then this last definition highlights the fact that because multicultural education uses critical pedagogy as its underlying philosophy and focuses on knowledge, reflection, and action or praxis as the basis for social change, multicultural education furthers the democratic principles of social justice. So, we have now multicultural education morphing into this tool of or outcome of critical pedagogy, which relies on this democratic and social justice framework. Now remember that we were looking at multicultural education because it's a way of thinking about how education itself, formal education in particular, is sensitive to, aware of, or incorporating culture into the structure and the content of education, rather than thinking of education as only being contextualized by external or non-school factors such as society and culture. So when we get to this critical pedagogy idea, I think that we are actually merging our ideas that sociocultural issues are something that happens outside of school, and our idea that multicultural education is a way to structure and to emphasize culture through the content of education. So we're attacking it from both sides, so to speak. And before we talk a little bit more about critical pedagogy, let me just go on to the third chapter, I think it's the third chapter in Wren, where he talks about 9 ways of defining culture, or actually on page 73, as I'm showing here, he summarizes 9 ways of defining culture. And I've highlighted a couple of these by including the names of some of the theorists, which I think you might have had a chance to look at as part of a class I'm teaching. So Parsons and Goffman in particular, and you're probably going to see some other ideas related to Marx and Weber and Durkheim and Elias and Habermas and anyway, many of the others that we've looked at perhaps in another class or in this class or another class. And let's look at some of these different ways of defining culture, and then let's think about ways that these definitions of culture and our ideas about multicultural education can be bounced off each other or can be integrated. If we look at a topical way of defining culture, this is when culture consists of everything specified on a list of topics or general categories that are ingredients or cultural traits or attributes. These are ways of saying that if you have, 5 of these 6 characteristics, then it is culture. And it is very much driven by a strict and a very limited definition of these categories or ingredients or traits or attributes. And so it's quite entry level in terms of just getting the description. If we look at structural ways of defining culture, they are going to look at culture as an integrated pattern of ideas or behavior. And in fact, I didn't write this on here earlier, but this would be very much a Durkheim. I'm just going to put a D for Durkheim. A way of integrating the pattern of ideas or behaviors and looking at the structure of, in our case, education, or the structure of culture and society, and the ways that ideas and behaviors create patterns to understand what culture is, so that if we see a pattern developing, or we can identify a pattern that exists, then we'll be able to understand the culture. A functional approach, which is very much from our Parsons perspective, says that culture is the way individuals or societies solve problems of adapting to the environment or living together. Remember, a functional perspective looks at how everything functions in relation to everything else. And it sees society as sort of a closed system, meaning that every part relies on every other part, and it's in many ways interdependent in a way that can change the value of certain parts of the society. It does mean, though, that there's also an emphasis on solving problems, and that there is an expectation or an assumption that culture is useful for solving problems. I just want to skip over historical for a second to talk about this 5th way, because it's also tied to Parsons, and it's the idea that we can normatively define culture, and say that culture is a group's ideals, values, or rules for living. Not necessarily meaning that it is a way of solving problems, or that it is a way that is directly tied to outcomes or behaviors or actions, but that it is a set of ideals, it's a set of expectations that then the group adheres to or follows. If I was to step back one and look at the historical way of defining culture, we could say it's because of the group's shared heritage and thinking about history as a context that everything occurs within. And then we have some others: behavioral, cognitive, symbolic, critical. I'd really like to focus on, just get directly to, quite frankly, the symbolic idea, because we looked at some of Goffman in an earlier part of a class that many of you have taken from me. And we can see that the symbolic interactionism, which was something that Goffman was involved in, or symbolic ways of defining culture, say that culture is a set of shared, socially constructed representations and meanings. Now, let me point out that if we look across these 9 definitions, they don't necessarily mutually exclude each other. It's not like if you find one that's helpful, for example, I find the normative one especially interesting because I think it explains why sometimes culture is not linked to reality. But it doesn't mean that because I think the normative is a way of describing some phenomena, that behavioral or cognitive or critical aren't ways of doing that as well. So there's interaction across these definitions. And remember that just because we define something doesn't mean that it is universally applicable. It just means that that's one way of defining it, one way of understanding it. But let me get back to the critical for a second and point out that a critical way of understanding or defining culture would say that cultural consists in those symbols and symbol-making activities that typically reflect and promote a society's current power relationships. Now, we ended our formal and informal definitions of multicultural education by specifically referencing critical pedagogy and saying that critical pedagogy focuses on knowledge, reflection, and action or praxis when we're talking about multicultural education as the basis for social change. And when we look at critical ways of defining culture, now we're looking at power relationships. And we're looking at how symbols and symbol making, which we've just talked about with our friend Goffman, are activities that reflect those power relationships or power structures. So when we think of multicultural education, or we think of society and culture and how it interacts with education, we are constantly being drawn back to the fact that society is often stratified. In other words, there are inequalities, there are differences that exist within society. And culture also reflects or reifies or represents those stratifications or those inequalities or those differences within society. So if we talk about socio-cultural issues in education, we have to be aware that there are differences and that those differences could signify different power and opportunity relationships. Again, that doesn't mean that other forces like normative or topical or structural or functional or whatever aren't also going on. But it does mean that we constantly need to reflect back on power and stratification. And so when we're doing that, we're bridging this gap between all of the sort of more pure theory that we were talking about when we were talking about sociological key thinkers and ways that they think about society and culture. And then we brought that into some specific examples. For example, in some of our discussions, we've been talking about issues of race and identity and culture. And so if we were to think about race, identity, and culture specifically in education settings, then how would we use our ideas about multicultural education and our definitions of culture, specifically those that come from more of a critical perspective, to help us frame other ways of also defining either culture or multicultural education? In other words, we're trying to synthesize all this. We're trying to bring it all together in a way that's meaningful. And one way to do that is to look a little more specifically at our friend Paolo Fairy. Now, this is not a book that I have asked many of you who will be watching this to read, certainly not in the class on sociocultural issues and in comparative and international education. Although you may have read it as part of another class on globalization and educational equity, or globalization and curriculum implications, or some other course that you might have taken. But I think it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about Fairy because it helps us understand how culture and society are embedded in not just the content, but also the structure and also the framework or context outside of school as well. So let's dive into the critical pedagogy just a little bit as a way to link all these. Now, Paolo Fairy is, let me just go past this for a second and see if I can get to it. Paolo Fairy, many of you may know, was very active in the 20th century. He is a Brazilian man who was working specifically with adult illiterates in northeast Brazil and gradually evolved a method to work with them, which was linked with some of the concepts that he outlined in a very well-known book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I am showing you the cover of here. And so what I want to do as I end this screencast and we move on to the next, is I want to start talking in the next screencast about pedagogy of the oppressed, about critical pedagogy, about some of Fairy's ideas, and then use that as a way to reflect back on Ren's ideas about conceptions of culture and our whole goal of looking at sociocultural issues in comparative and international education. So that's where we're headed. See you in the next screencast.